Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we unroll a map not drawn on paper, but charted across the surface of the sea. A tale carried by outrigger canoes and whispered into the dark by starlit winds. It is a story not only of direction, but of devotion. A time when finding your way meant memorizing the curve of a wave, the shape of clouds, and most tenderly, the angle of the moon's rise. This is the story of when the moon was a compass, and the Pacific Ocean, vast, ancient, unknowable, was not feared, but read like scripture. For navigators who didn't have compasses, sextants, or GPS, they sure made finding remote islands in the middle of an infinite ocean look like a hobby. It really gives new meaning to the phrase, just wing it. Before we begin, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if this kind of voyage brings calm to your evening. And if you're somewhere between Moonlight and shoreline, drop a coordinate in the comments. Maybe your corner of the earth has a story still waiting to be told. Now, let the ocean arrive quietly in your breath. Let the day slip over the horizon like a sun behind the sails. Rest your hands, soften your shoulders. Let your mind drift far from the dock. Our story tonight sets sail on a canoe with no keel, no rudder, and no compass, yet with far more direction than any modern map could offer. The earliest Polynesian navigators began their voyages over 2,000 years ago. They traveled across thousands of miles of open sea in wooden double-hulled canoes, without instruments. But they were never lost. Their navigation relied entirely on their surroundings. Wind, birds, ocean swell, stars, and the moon. We begin in a place now known as Seagulls, a coral atoll in the western Pacific that is home to a people who have preserved this ancient tradition longer than nearly anyone else. Here, traditional navigation is called wayfinding, and one of its last great masters was Mau Pielug. Mau, born in 1932, began learning how to read the sea before he could read anything else. He was taught in the Po tradition, a sacred system passed from master to student, often in secrecy. He learned to feel the direction of the swells through his bones while lying in a canoe. He studied how seabirds leave and return to land, how certain clouds gather above invisible islands, and how the moon, in all her phases, dances with the sea. The moon's role in navigation is both practical and poetic. Her light, waxing and waning, shapes the visibility of stars, the very constellations Polynesians used to track latitude. Her position at moonrise and moonset changes each night, giving navigators a shifting but predictable horizon marker. In the days before full moons, the light would be strong enough to sail through the night, and even the reflection on the ocean could guide a canoe's path like a trail of silver drawn across the sea. One of Mau's most extraordinary feats was not just sailing, but teaching. In 1976, he became the navigator of the Hokulia, a traditional Polynesian canoe built in Hawaii to prove that ancient Polynesians could indeed have traveled vast ocean distances. Mau guided the Hokulia over 2,500 nautical miles from Hawaii to Tahiti without any modern instruments, only with what he'd learned from the ocean and the moon. There were times during the voyage when storms obscured the stars, when swells collided from different directions, and when every known pattern dissolved into chaos. It was during these times that Mau would turn not to panic, but to rhythm. He'd watch the moon rise, sometimes behind clouds, sometimes over the shoulder of a wave, and orient the canoe by its arc. The moon never lied. She was slow, graceful, but faithful. In traditional Polynesian navigation, there's a mental chart known as an itak. It isn't drawn or spoken aloud. It's a moving reference, where islands are imagined in relation to stars and celestial events. The canoe becomes still in this imagined map, and the islands themselves move beneath the stars. This is hard for modern minds to understand, but it's deeply rooted in how the Polynesians saw motion, not as us moving through the world, but the world moving around us. And the moon, floating silently across the sky, served as a metronome for this world. Not just a light, but a rhythm. When to sleep, when to fish, when to sail, when to wait. For example, on nights of the first quarter moon, many Polynesian communities believed the ocean was gentler, the winds more trustworthy. On full moons, fish would rise closer to the surface, drawn by the glow. And on new moons, when the sky turned black, navigators would rely instead on memory, reconstructing their star paths by feel rather than sight. A famous tale comes from the island of Puluwat, where a navigator named Hippour once led a canoe across hundreds of miles to Saipan. His student, curious how he managed to stay on course in cloudy weather, asked what signs he used. Hippour simply said, "I watched the moon sleep, and she told me where I was." The metaphor isn't accidental. In many Pacific cultures, the moon isn't just a celestial object, but a companion, a storyteller, a gentle watcher. In Samoa, she is called Sina. In Maori myth, the moon is Marama, a being of order and cycles, one who keeps the rhythm of tides and hearts. Even the word navigation comes from Latin, navis, ship, and agira, to drive. But in Polynesia, it was less about control and more about listening. The moon didn't drive, she hummed. And so, for centuries, these early voyagers would rise quietly before dawn, eyes scanning the low eastern horizon, waiting for that first pale crescent to appear. In that moment, a path would open, not marked by buoys or signs, but by something older, a glowing arc across dark water. The beauty of Polynesian navigation was that it was never just technical. It was spiritual, embodied, familial. A navigator was not merely a traveler, but a memory keeper, trained to know the ocean's moods like the way one knows a parent's voice. And the moon, luminous and slow, became the pulse behind it all. Mau Pielug, in teaching the Hawaiian crew of the Hokulia, refused to draw charts or write down directions. Instead, he spoke in metaphors, stories, gestures. He would point to the wind, close his eyes, and listen. He would sit in the hull and feel for rhythm, waiting for the swells to rise and fall in patterns. When asked how he knew they were still on course, he replied, "Because the canoe is singing the right song." This poetic way of understanding the world was practical too. The moon's rise and set could be timed. If you stood on a canoe deck on the equator, the moon would rise in the east and set in the west, much like the sun. But as you moved further north or south, its arc tilted. Over time, a skilled navigator could tell where they were latitudinally simply by watching the slant of the moon's path against the sea. A full moon rising low and golden on the horizon gave enough light to watch the shape of the waves and check the directions of ocean swells. These swells, pushed by distant storms, would move across the ocean in consistent bands. Polynesian navigators gave each swell a name and a personality. One might be the mother swell, another the cousin. The moon, then, became the voice that helped identify each member of the family. This memory system was more than mental, it was bodily. Navigators like Mao could lie in the canoe and feel the crossing of swells from different angles. Their minds held a living, layered map, not just of space, but of movement. One of the most remarkable stories of traditional lunar navigation comes not from the Pacific but echoes it through time. In the 1970s, after Mao helped complete the Hokulia's first voyage to Tahiti, he returned to Micronesia with a dream of restoring wayfinding traditions across island cultures. He trained new generations, and from there a quiet resurgence began. The moon, once trusted but nearly forgotten, found her way back into the hearts of navigators. The Marshall Islands, for example, use stick charts, a lattice of bent palm ribs, seashells, and fiber string, to show wave refraction and swell patterns. While the charts were never taken on the canoe, they were memorized before departure. These patterns were overlaid with knowledge of star paths, seasonal wind shifts, and, of course, lunar cues. When the moon was half full, rising slightly after sunset, navigators would use it as a fixed orientation tool. At night, when stars blinked in and out of sight behind clouds, the moon remained steady. She became a beacon. In fact, many sailing chants composed by Polynesians include lines about the moon holding the way, or the moon sitting above the island we seek. It was not superstition, though it may sound like it. It was deeply empirical, rooted in generations of observation passed through oral memory. Over hundreds of years, sailing routes from Tahiti to Hawaii, from Fiji to Aotearoa, and from Samoa to the Marquesas were not only maintained but refined. The moon played her role, rising and falling like a tide in the sky, her patterns repeating with slow precision. A lunar cycle is 29.5 days long, which means each night, the moon rises about 50 minutes later than the night before. Navigators used this predictable shift to estimate how many nights had passed since departure. If the moon rose halfway through the night instead of at sunset, they knew they were approaching the midpoint of their journey. This rhythm, once memorized, was hard to forget. Many navigators could recall, decades later, which phase the moon was in when they first learned to sail to a particular island. It wasn't just timing, it was story, and it was everywhere. In Tonga, sailors would use a small bowl of water to reflect the moon's arc. This allowed them to measure its angle even when the sky was clouded. The moon's reflection would ripple across the bowl like a moving compass needle. It was simple but elegant. Elsewhere, in the Solomon Islands, sailors noticed that under a full moon, phosphorescent plankton glowed more vividly in the wake of their canoes, creating soft trails like lanterns beneath the surface. These glowing paths could be followed at night, another quiet map left behind by light and motion. Even today, you can hear echoes of this practice. On some remote atolls, elders still sit outside after dusk, watching the horizon. They don't consult apps or charts. They tilt their heads, gaze upward, and mutter small notes about the moon's tilt, her fullness, the color of her edge. Some will say, "She sleeps low tonight," meaning it's a good time to sail. Others will say, "She rides too high," meaning the sea is unsettled, and the moon, as ever, listens. Perhaps the most touching part of this lunar navigation tradition is not just that it worked, but that it continues. The Kli, after many voyages, still sails today, as do sister canoes like the Hikianalia and Okeanos. They sail without GPS. They move with the stars, and when the stars are hidden, they wait for the moon to rise. In 2014, the Hokulia departed Hawaii once more, this time for a worldwide voyage. On board were young navigators learning to track constellations and moonrise. In blogs sent back from the deck, many described the moment of nightfall as sacred. When silence fell, the sea darkened, and the moon first pierced the horizon. There, in that moment, all noise stopped. It was as if time paused for her arrival, and in that pause, directions became clear. In many ways, Polynesian lunar navigation represents more than just travel. It is a lesson in trust in the natural world, in memory passed from mouth to mouth, and in the quiet instructions hidden in moonlight. It's not so different from the way we find our way through sleep, really. Not by landmarks or destinations, but by rhythm, by feeling, by the unseen pull of something ancient and steady. And as we return now to the waters near the Marshall Islands, near Samoa and Tahiti and Rapa Nui, the moon returns too, gleaming across open water like a silver path drawn with one hand. There's a calm that settles on these seas, not the silence of stillness, but of attentiveness. The sea is always listening, the moon always watching, and those who sail between them move not just through space, but through ceremony. One such ceremony, still performed in the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, involves placing a coconut frond at the bow of the canoe just before setting sail. The frond is chosen based on the moon's phase. A young crescent might mean a journey for gathering. A full moon might suggest a journey to reunite with family. The frond is then left at sea, a silent offering, perhaps to the tide or to memory itself. Elders say that when they sailed as children, their grandfathers would hum softly during moonlit nights, melodies without words, just the same 4 or 5 notes over and over, tuned to the rise and fall of the boat. These weren't lullabies in the usual sense, but something more, a kind of rhythmic spell, a way to keep the canoe aligned not just with the waves, but with the internal compass of calm. For some islands, the moon's position even played a role in social gatherings. Weddings were held when the moon was waxing, growing fuller, so that love might grow too. Fishing expeditions began when the moon was new and the sea less illuminated, better for hiding bait and shadowing nets. And some say that those born beneath a waning moon were believed to dream more vividly, more deeply attuned to water and night. And all of this was learned without books, without sextants, without numbers. Instead, it was passed across generations as observation layered with story. A young sailor might learn, when the moon sits just above the sea before dawn, turn your bow to her shoulder, and you'll find the outer reef. Another might be told, watch her lean westward after she is tired. That's when the wind forgets its promise. These were facts wrapped in poetry, and they worked. There's a profound stillness in thinking about that. That human beings, alone in canoes the size of small trucks, once crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean using nothing but wind, stars, and the moon. And that they did so again and again, with enough confidence to bring children along, to sing as they sailed, to sleep beneath nothing but canvas and constellation. Modern science has filled in many of the gaps now. We know how lunar refraction affects the sea. We understand the mathematics of tidal cycles and gravitational pulls. We can model swell patterns and wave interference in computer simulations. But none of that changes the truth at the center of this story. That for hundreds of years, people sailed with the moon as their compass, and they arrived again and again. And while it's tempting to view these journeys as magic, they were, and are, something else entirely. They are a demonstration of what careful attention looks like. The moon was not a symbol, not a deity, not a dream. It was a tool, a guide, a friend. Today, if you travel to the island of Seagulls, where Pielug was born, you can still meet those who sail this way. They will tell you about attack, a method of navigation using imaginary reference points based on shifting star alignments. They will show you the coral paths that mark where canoes should be dragged at low tide. And if you ask them about the moon, they'll smile, look up, and say, "She's how we know when it's time." One of the most beautiful parts of this tradition is that it insists on presence. You cannot navigate by the moon from a book. You must be there, looking, listening. The canoe is your map, the ocean your page, and the moon is the punctuation, rising steadily, telling you when to pause, when to shift, when to trust. So, as we drift now toward sleep, imagine her, our old silver compass, hanging low over an empty sea. Her reflection trembles slightly with the current, painting the canoe's underside in shimmering light. Somewhere, a navigator tilts his head, adjusts the sail by a hand's width, and hums a song his grandfather once hummed. He does not speak. He does not need to. The moon has already told him everything he needs to know. And you, voyager, need not sail far tonight. The winds are quiet. The tide is kind. Let the rhythm of water, the breath of air, and the pull of the moon guide you inward, toward rest. Your destination is close now. It was never a place. It was always the stillness. Good night. Welcome, Voyager. You've arrived just in time for one of the stranger entries in the global guestbook. On our second story of the night, we're sailing past the edge of what was once thought to be the end of the world, to a place that, for centuries, was sketched in only the boldest strokes. A place once called Terra Draconis, the land of dragons. It's a story that takes us into the ink-stained minds of old cartographers and the salt-crusted journals of 16th century sea captains, where dragons didn't just decorate margins, they guarded the unknown. Anyway, if you find these drifting stories calming to your compass, drop anchor with a like and subscribe, and chart your location in the comments. Latitude or landmark, we'd love to know where your tide is coming in from. And if your coast hides any forgotten lore, it may just appear in a future tale. Now, lean gently into the quiet. Imagine the creak of wooden hull beneath you, the sigh of canvas, the hush of a distant horizon coming into view. Let your breath match the slow rhythm of waves. Let the light dim, and the noise retreat behind you like the fading shore. Our story tonight sets sail in the year 1532, aboard a Portuguese vessel off the southern coasts of what was then largely uncharted territory, below Java, east of Africa, west of the myth of Terra Australis. The name of the ship is not recorded, but the man who gave us tonight's mystery is Orance Fine, a French cartographer working not from a captain's bridge, but from a desk in Paris. Orance Fine, sometimes spelled Orontius Phineas, was a mathematician, mapmaker, and professor at the College Royal. In 1531, he published one of the earliest heart-shaped projections of the world, called the Cordiform Map. And on that curious rendering, he included something astonishing: a massive southern continent labeled Terra Australis Recenter Inventa, sed non dum plene cognita. The southern land recently discovered, but not yet fully known. In other records and on other maps around this time, a portion of this land would also appear under another name, Terra Draconis, or Land of Dragons. The name wasn't just poetic. It reflected a deep fear of the South. For medieval and early Renaissance Europeans, the unknown wasn't simply blank, it was dangerous. The farther south one went beyond the equator, the more treacherous and speculative the territory became. Temperatures were believed to become unbearable. Water boiled on its own, skin darkened, and monsters, both human and bestial, roamed freely. Where knowledge ends, imagination begins, and nowhere was that more true than in the cartographic traditions of the 15th and 16th centuries. In Fine's time, mapmakers relied not just on explorers, but on books, hearsay, second-hand reports, and the extrapolated geography of classical antiquity. They read Ptolemy, Aristotle, Pliny the Elder. They heard stories from sailors and scribes. And when there were no facts to anchor to, they drew dragons. In 1513, Turkish Admiral Piri Reis published a map that included parts of South America, Africa, and what some fringe theorists later tried to interpret as Antarctica. The coasts on that map were studded with strange animals, horned sea beasts, and ships locked in eternal battles with creatures whose names we'll never know. A decade later, similar images began appearing near the South Pole on European maps, labeled not just Terra Australis, but sometimes Regio Patalis and more vividly, Terra Draconis. The question is, why dragons? And why here? The answer, like many things in exploration history, lies in layers. Part myth, part metaphor, part psychological projection. For one, the concept of dragons wasn't uniform. To a European cartographer, dragons weren't always fire-breathing serpents. They were shorthand for the unknown. They represented parts of the world where ships had vanished or where records ceased to exist. Drawing one at the edge of a continent was a way of saying, there be mysteries here, without needing to explain further. But there's another possibility, and it comes from reports, often exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood, of real animals seen in foreign lands. Consider the Komodo dragon, first documented by Western scientists in the early 20th century, but known to local Indonesian populations for centuries. Measuring up to 10 feet in length and possessing a venomous bite, the Komodo dragon may well have been a real creature that gave rise to earlier legends. Dutch explorers in the East Indies recorded tales of giant lizards. Some may have even glimpsed them across the archipelagos. If those stories traveled back to Europe, distorted, translated, made monstrous, then it's easy to see how dragon might be the conclusion. And then there are the fiery landscapes themselves. If you look at the volcanic arcs that encircle the Pacific, stretching from Indonesia to New Zealand, the Philippines to the Aleutians, you'll see that many southern lands known or guessed at by early Europeans were marked by eruptions. The Ring of Fire is aptly named. To sail near Java or Papua, or even the subantarctic islands like the Kerguelens, is to witness smoke rising from stone. It's not a far leap from Fire Mountain to Fire Beast. And what else breathes fire but a dragon? In 1595, Dutch navigator Willem Barents sailed north rather than south, in search of the Northeast Passage. His maps, too, bore warning creatures, particularly around Novaya Zemlya and the Arctic fringes. But it was in the southern margins that the true monsters lay. In some cases, the dragons drawn were not artistic flights of fancy, but copied wholesale from earlier sources like the Carta Marina of Olaus Magnus, a 1539 map of the Nordic world that included sea serpents, whale birds, and tusked fish capable of swallowing ships. So when Orens Fine included Terra Draconis, he wasn't alone. His was one voice in a larger chorus of cartographers who filled in the blanks not with silence, but with warnings. And yet, something curious happened. Over the next century, as exploration continued in southern lands like Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica began to take shape on actual nautical charts, the dragons vanished. The monsters retreated with each new measurement, each fresh sighting logged by compass and quadrant, each shoreline sketched not from conjecture but from a spyglass and ink-dipped hand. As reality advanced, myth receded. Terra Draconis was replaced by Terra Australis Incognita, and eventually, just Australia, named after the Latin for southern. By the time Captain James Cook charted New Zealand in the 1770s and British penal colonies were being established in Botany Bay, the fire-breathing guardians of the South had all but disappeared from serious maps. Though in some corners, if you look closely enough, a horned shadow or curling tail may still haunt the margins. But even after the Age of Enlightenment snuffed out many of the beasts once feared, the spirit of Terra Draconis never quite left. It lingered in language, in the hush before setting out to sea, in the instinct to give danger a shape. To this day, we refer to the unknown as uncharted territory, and the act of facing fear as slaying your dragons. For cartographers, the act of mapping was more than scientific, it was psychological. It was an act of imagination. There's a small but fascinating theory among historians of science that Terra Draconis may not have been a single place at all. Rather, it was a term that drifted, a floating cipher for anywhere the edge of knowledge was sharpest. In that sense, Terra Draconis could be the Amazon jungle, the interior of Africa, or the deep-sea trench that still lies unmapped between Fiji and Tonga. All of them dragon lands in their time. And so, when 16th century mariners looked at the massive blank canvas south of Java, they painted what they feared, or what they hoped never to encounter. This was not ignorance in the modern sense, but a kind of reverence, a nod to the world's ability to outpace human certainty. There is something deeply humbling in that, something we've mostly forgotten in an age where satellites can spot a village through clouds. But remnants remain even now. If you visit the National Library of France and stand before Fine's heart-shaped map, the Nova 8 Integra Universi Orbis Descriptio, you'll notice how the imagined southern continent wraps upward in an arc, enclosing the bottom of the known world like the curved jaw of some great subterranean creature. Its landmass is both grounded and unknowable, scrawled with mountains that never existed and rivers that never ran, stitched together from sailors' tales and scholarly theories. There's no dragon drawn there, no scales or wings, just the name and the silence behind it. In more modern times, this romanticized imagining of southern lands took on a new kind of mystique. In 1820, when the first confirmed sightings of Antarctica were reported, it was from ships locked in ice and mist, straining to see through snow and the curve of the earth. The continent was not the fiery land of old. It was white, silent, and lethally cold. But it was no less alien, and for some, it remained a dragon, only now sleeping beneath snow instead of smoke. Interestingly, the symbolism was not lost on early explorers. Many wrote in diaries not of discovery, but of trespass. They didn't conquer the Antarctic, they entered cautiously, aware of their fragility. The monster had changed form, but not temperament. Meanwhile, Australia, once thought to be part of this imagined Terra Draconis, was found to be far older, geologically speaking, than most of the continents charted by European minds. Its deserts stretch wider. Its creatures, like the platypus and the cassowary, defy tidy classification. Even its trees, like the woolly pine, seem borrowed from eras long extinct. In this way, the dragon did not die. It simply grew quiet, waiting for us to understand it differently. And then there are the cultural dragons, the ones that do not breathe fire but memory. For many Aboriginal peoples in Australia, the land is mapped not with borders and names, but with stories. The Dreamtime Chukurpa is a system of song lines, ancestral paths etched into the land not just by feet but by voice and belief. Serpents coil through these stories too, particularly the rainbow serpent, a powerful creator being found across many language groups and oral traditions. European dragons guarded treasure and punished greed, but the rainbow serpent brought water, carved valleys, and shaped the ground itself. It was not something to be slain but understood, a being of cycles, flood, drought, renewal. Seen from this lens, perhaps Terra Draconis was never a warning, but an invitation to pay attention, to let the unfamiliar remain mysterious long enough to teach us something. It's a humbling realization, and one that aligns with how modern scientists now approach remote sensing, deep-sea mapping, and exploration in places still veiled to us. We may have GPS, but we don't know what lies at the bottom of the Tonga Trench, or the full network of tunnels beneath Antarctica's ice. We're still making maps, still chasing dragons in quieter, more data-driven ways. The term Terra Draconis has, in recent decades, found a second life among fantasy cartographers and speculative fiction writers, who use it as a metaphor for imagined geographies, much like Tolkien's Middle-earth or Le Guin's archipelagos. But its original use as a fearful name on a real map remains a profound reminder of how humans process uncertainty. There's one final detail, one that often goes unnoticed. In a margin of Orent's Fine's map, a tiny sea vessel is etched, tossed amid waves. There are no dragons immediately near it, no beasts clawing at the hull. But if you look at the position of the ship, you'll see it's heading due south, toward the widest, emptiest part of the map, toward Terra Draconis. No anchor, no hesitation, just wind, sail, and the open unknown. It's a fitting image for our own lives, in a way. We chart paths across oceans of uncertainty, knowing full well that something waits in the unmarked water. Maybe it's danger, maybe it's beauty, maybe, like the early mariners feared, it's something so strange we can only name it with symbols. But either way we go, we trace the edge of the map, we ask the question, we sail toward dragons. And in doing so, we preserve a tradition that is older than ink, older than compass, older than fear itself. The act of charting, after all, is not just about drawing borders or sketching coastlines. It is about admitting there is more than we can know. The dragon is not the danger, it is the placeholder, a graceful, scaly bookmark in the story of the world, reminding us where curiosity must step in when certainty runs dry. There is something quietly noble in the early mapmakers' honesty. They didn't pretend to know everything. Instead, they filled the spaces they couldn't understand with symbols of imagination, beasts that watched from the margins. They carved dragons not as lies, but as invitations, as if to say, "This far we know. Beyond here, you must go and see for yourself." And see we did. Ships creaked through uncharted waters. Botanists pressed unfamiliar leaves into books. Sailors leaned over rails to catch glimpses of new coastlines rising from mist. And slowly, Terra Draconis faded, not as a failure of understanding, but as a quiet triumph of exploration. The dragon receded not with a scream, but with a sigh, curling its tail around the final edge of the parchment, giving way to names like Victoria, Tasmania, and Antarctica. And yet, the spirit of the dragon lives on, not in flames or scales, but in the way we approach every unknown. The deep sea, the distant galaxy, the locked chamber of a glacier. In these places we still pause. We still draw breath before entering. We still whisper, in some part of ourselves, that a guardian might yet be waiting. In 2012, a team of researchers in East Antarctica drilled through nearly 2 miles of ice to reach Lake Vostok, a subglacial body of water untouched by sunlight for millions of years. As the borehole neared the lake's surface, great care was taken not to contaminate it, not to introduce modern life to what might be a pristine ancient ecosystem. One of the researchers, in an interview, compared the act to cracking open a myth. He said, "We don't know what's down there, but whatever it is, it's been waiting a very long time. It is hard to imagine a more fitting echo of Terra Draconis than that. And so, perhaps the dragon was never truly a monster. Perhaps it was a metaphor for the sacredness of the unknown, a signal to proceed slowly, to listen carefully, to carry respect into mystery." On an old wall in Lisbon, in the Alfama district where the houses are stacked like books, there's a faded tile map of the known world from the mid-1500s. And in the far southern corner, where the shapes lose confidence and the sea grows pale with uncharted promise, a single Latin phrase is painted: "Hic sunt dracons." Here be dragons. But if you trace your finger gently over the cracked blue ceramic, you'll see that the dragon isn't snarling. It isn't coiled in menace. Its wings are folded. Its mouth is closed. It faces outward, toward the edge of the map, not to threaten, but to guide. It is looking where we are meant to look, forward, to the next blank space, to the next shimmering mirage of possibility. And that, Voyager, is what you carry with you now. A story wrapped not in certainty, but in wonder. A reminder that the world has always balanced on the delicate line between the known and the imagined, between the ink and the breath. So the next time you look at a map, be it on paper or glowing from a screen, pause a moment at the corners, the places no one names, the patches of sea or forest or clouded sky that lie just outside the margins of familiarity. And remember Terra Draconis, not as a mistake, but as a whisper, a curved suggestion from the past, saying, "Here is where the story begins." Leave a coordinate in the comments if your part of the world has ever felt like a place where dragons might linger. Maybe you've walked a foggy ridge, or stood beneath stars that seemed just slightly too close, or felt the stillness before a storm and known you were standing on the edge of something vast. So let us know. Perhaps your landscape will be the next to rise from the margins and into the heart of the map. Thank you for drifting with us tonight, across cartographic oceans and into quiet places ink once feared to tread. If this voyage eased your thoughts or stirred your dreams, we invite you to like and subscribe. More voyages await, gentle ones, with kind winds and steady stars. And now sleep, voyager. Let the parchment curl around you. Let the sea be calm. Let the dragons of your dreams guard you, not from fear, but from forgetfulness. For beyond every horizon, there's always something waiting to be named. And every map begins with a breath. Welcome, voyager. On our third story of the night, we sail not by stars alone, but by syllables. A journey through salt and memory, where verses once mapped the deep. We're heading back to the medieval Indian Ocean, to a time when knowledge didn't live in books or scrolls, but in breath and repetition. When the waves themselves became stanzas, and the wind carried recitations rather than ink. Some sailors carried astrolabes, others compasses, but the cleverest among them, they just hummed. In any case, if you've enjoyed drifting along these tales before, consider leaving a like and subscribing to keep your bearings set for future voyages. And in the spirit of ancient sea charts, drop a coordinate in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from. Perhaps your shore once echoed with verses of its own. Who knows, we might plot a future story there too. Now, let your shoulders settle, as gently as a dhow settling into a harbor. Let the hush of distant waves soften your thoughts. Picture the rustle of sailcloth above, and the scent of sun-warmed wood beneath. Let the breeze carry you, not forward or back, but inward, into stillness. Our story tonight begins with a sailor standing barefoot at the edge of Oman, his shadow long and stretching across the sand, his eyes set on the eastern horizon. He is unnamed in the records, but he was one of thousands, a generation of traders and navigators, born along the western shorelines of the Indian Ocean and raised on the rhythmic verses of the Ramani. These were poems unlike any others, not written to be read, but sung, chanted in a low, swaying cadence as sails unfurled and hulls creaked against the swell. Each line of a Ramani was a map, each word a signal. Shoals, reefs, tidal shifts, prevailing winds, even the behavior of fish or the smell of coming rain. Knowledge that would fill libraries if written, but instead lived only in the minds of those who recited them. And recite they did, at sea and on land, in the courtyard shadows of Muscat, in the coconut groves of Zanzibar, along the steps of Kochi's backwaters, and among the coral dwellings of the Lamu archipelago. These chants stretched across thousands of miles, forming an invisible web of memory that connected East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. The earliest mentions of this oral sea lore come not from historians, but from the logs of perplexed European sailors in the 16th century. The Portuguese, arriving with towering caravels and gunpowder pride, found local navigators who sailed just as far without so much as a sextant. Instead, they spoke of verses passed from grandfather to grandson, memorized through childhood, recited aloud before every journey. Scholars now believe this system of navigation evolved from earlier Babylonian and Greek influences, but was profoundly reshaped by the Arab maritime tradition. For these navigators, the sea was not merely crossed, it was read, and every current, every island silhouette was a word in a larger, fluid language. In the 10th century, the Persian geographer al-Muqaddasi remarked that sailors from Oman could predict winds with uncanny accuracy. He assumed they were using magical methods. In truth, They were drawing from a mental library shaped by centuries of intergenerational observation, encoded in poetry, shaped to the rhythm of rowing, designed to be unforgettable. One preserved fragment, recorded in Zanzibar in the 19th century by Swahili chroniclers, goes something like this, in rough translation. When the moon breaks wide at Safar's end, the wind that whispers comes from Yemen's bend, past Sheila's reef, where dolphins leap, the black rock rises from the deep. Simple but dense with instruction. The moon phase points to the month of Safar in the Islamic calendar, a time when the northeast monsoon begins to stir. The wind from Yemen's bend indicates a reliable trade wind pushing southward. Sheila Reef was a known hazard off the coast of Lamu, and the Black Rock marks a basalt formation near Pate Island, a crucial turning point for ships headed toward the Somali coast. But these chants weren't only navigational. Some described the scent of foreign harbors, the color of sunrise at sea, the taste of rain from different latitudes. There were verses for ship repair, for predicting illness, for honoring the drowned. The ocean was not a void to be crossed, but a library, open, oral, endless. It's important to understand how vital this method was for preserving knowledge in an age where maps were rare and often inaccurate. Parchment could rot, ink could run, but memory survived if carried across lips. In the humid, salt-heavy climate of the Indian Ocean, a book might last a decade. A well-recited verse could live for generations. European cartographers sometimes mocked these poetic traditions. A Jesuit missionary in Goa once wrote that Arab sailors sing the sea as if they hope to lull it. He missed the point entirely. The songs weren't lullabies, they were instruments of precision, data carried in meter and rhyme. We know from oral histories in coastal Yemen and Oman that some verses were restricted, sacred even, only recited in full by elders or senior navigators. There are stories of apprentices spending years just listening before being allowed to chant aloud. The ocean was not given to you all at once. It had to be earned line by line. One extraordinary account survives in the writings of Ibn Majid, the famed 15th century navigator of Ras Al Khaimah. Often called the Lion of the Sea, he composed complex maritime treatises, but even he acknowledged the supremacy of the spoken word at sea. He wrote that a man may have 1,000 maps and still lose his way, but the verse of his father's voice will bring him home. By the 1700s, with the arrival of standardized maps and magnetic compasses, this oral tradition began to fade. European influence, along with increased literacy, slowly replaced verse with charts and tables. Many of the chants were never recorded. Some only survive as fragments, tucked in travelogues or remembered by coastal elders now gone. Still, in some corners of the ocean's edge, whispers remain. Off the Kenyan coast, elders in the Bajuni community still recall parts of verses describing the waters around Kismayo. In Oman's Dhofar region, fishermen still recite weather rhymes that echo ancient navigational chants. The ocean remembers, even if we forget. It is said that the last great Ramani was composed in the late 1800s, describing the journey from Sur in Oman to Calicut in Kerala. Over 200 lines long, it was memorized by a single dhow captain and passed to 2 of his sons. One of them died at sea. The other, too old to sail, taught parts of it to a curious British linguist in 1937. The rest is lost. Perhaps somewhere, in a quiet inlet, someone still hums a line without knowing what it once meant. A remnant of a map no longer seen, but still sung. We now drift southward, toward the Swahili coast. Here, Arabic and African traditions braided together like the ropes that lash dowels to dhow masts. The people of Lamu, Pemba, and Kilwa spoke in rhythms shaped by wind and tide. Their language, Swahili, was itself a vessel, carrying Persian, Arabic, Bantu, and Indian sounds. It is no surprise that in this region, song became survival. Oral navigation was not unique to the Arab world. Polynesian voyagers used star charts made of bamboo and cowrie shells. Inuit hunters read the echo of ice. But in the Indian Ocean, what distinguished the Ramani tradition was its scale. Over 4,000 miles of open sea could be crossed with nothing but verses carried in the mind, and the moon as witness. There were verses for approaching harbors at night, when no lighthouse flared. One chant, partially recovered from a Zanzibari elder in the 1960s, described the glint of wet basalt on Pemba Island as a nighttime marker, and warned of a coral tongue just beneath the surface. It was not poetic in the modern sense, no metaphors, no flourish, just detail encoded and memorized. And the verses could be responsive. If the winds shifted, an experienced navigator would alter the order of the chant midsail, looping back to a remembered line, or improvising a new one that echoed the old. This made them resilient, adaptable, a living archive of the sea. In Oman, during seasonal gatherings at Sur or Salalah, old captains were once invited to chant from memory, surrounded by younger men with sand in their hair and calluses from sail work. These gatherings were as much for teaching as for honoring. Each performance was a retrieval of a map no longer drawn, but deeply felt. There is a story told in Salalah of a captain named Hamoud, who could recall every harbor between Berbera and Bombay. He had never learned to read. His hands trembled on land, but at sea his voice was steady. In his final years, as steamships replaced sails, he would sit on the beach with his grandson, reciting fragments to the rhythm of a carved wooden drum. The boy grew up and left for Muscat, but said he could still hear the rhythm of those verses in traffic and wind. It was like knowing the smell of a storm before the clouds arrive. He said, the body remembers what the mind forgets. As the 20th century advanced, efforts to preserve these traditions grew more urgent. A few linguists and anthropologists attempted to record surviving chants. In Kenya, a British scholar named Harold Ingrams interviewed coastal navigators in the 1930s, noting how some men still recalled entire segments of Ramani, even though they hadn't sailed in decades. His notes are now stored in the Royal Geographical Society archives, yellowed and curled at the edges. But language doesn't fossilize well. Outside of performance, a chant is just a list of place names and weather descriptions. It is in the telling, the lilt, the pauses between lines, that the meaning unfolds. Just like a coastline is meaningless without the motion of the tide, a navigation verse without voice is only half alive. In 2007, a group of researchers from Oman's Ministry of Heritage traveled to coastal villages to document the few remaining maritime chants. They found only a handful of elders who still remembered portions. One old fisherman named Rashid could recite the opening lines of a voyage from Sur to the Malabar coast. When asked how he remembered it, he tapped his chest and said, "It's here. I walked it in my mind every time we sailed." Interestingly, these verses were not only practical, but layered with devotional language. Many began with invocations to God, or to the Prophet Muhammad, asking for calm seas and favoring winds. Others referenced pre-Islamic gods of the sea, especially in parts of East Africa where older traditions remained. The chants were not purely technical. They were spiritual, emotional, mnemonic, and geographic all at once. One could argue they weren't just maps, they were rituals. Each recitation was a gesture of humility, a recognition that the ocean could not be tamed, only listened to. The chant was not meant to conquer the sea, but to accompany it. In the fishing village of Mirbat, on Oman's southern coast, a crumbling wall still bears graffiti that some say is part of an old Ramani. The script is too faded to confirm, but the pattern of repetition suggests verse. Locals say it was drawn by a homesick sailor who didn't want his route forgotten. A carved line of verse where once the ocean's voice echoed. There's something haunting about this idea, that knowledge once vital for survival now lingers only in fragments, like flotsam washed up after a wreck. We've replaced chance with satellite GPS, paper maps with glowing screens. And yet, in certain conditions, even now, a seasoned sailor might pause, feel the shift of wind on his cheek, and remember a line he thought lost. The ocean still speaks, but fewer of us remember how to listen. It's tempting to romanticize all this, to picture noble mariners singing beneath the stars. But the reality was harder. The Romani were tools, and like all tools, they were used under duress. These sailors faced storms without warning, illness without medicine, and often hunger that gnawed as steadily as the waves. The chant helped them survive, but it did not shield them. Many who sailed by verse never returned. Their knowledge sank with them, unrecorded. Others passed their chants to sons or apprentices who left the trade, or turned to motorboats or moved inland. But perhaps not all was lost. In recent years, musicians along the Arabian coast have begun incorporating fragments of maritime verse into folk songs, not to perform them as history, but to breathe life back into them. The rhythm shifts slightly, the words blend with oud and drum, and in those new voices, the ocean stirs again. A few schools in Muscat and Salalah now teach children about Romani tradition as part of cultural heritage. They chant simplified verses, more for performance than navigation. Still, the cadence remains, and maybe, just maybe, a child reciting those lines will someday hear the wind shift and feel something stir in their chest. A direction, a memory, a path not marked by signs, but by syllables. So, let's not think of this tradition as vanished. Let's imagine it as latent, tucked beneath the surface, like a reef visible only at the lowest tide. It is waiting not to be rediscovered, but to be retold. Our story winds toward the Horn of Africa, where Somalia's coastline arcs like a bow drawn toward Arabia. Here, too, the traditions of sung navigation echoed between promontories and the open blue. Somali sailors, some tracing their lineage to ancient traders who plied the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, relied on their own oral cartographies. Their knowledge was often interwoven with poetry, as Somali culture holds verse in high regard. Among the Somali, the Girar form, a rhythmic, chant-like poem, was used for both praise and practical recounting. While often directed toward camels or heroes, it was not unheard of for seasoned sailors to use similar rhythms in recalling sea routes. There are verses that mention the path of stars above Berbera, or the split-tooth rock beneath Ras Hafen. Lines embedded with orientation as well as metaphor. When monsoon winds shifted, ships departed by moonlight. At those times, the chants lengthened. Some included invocations to the jinn of the sea, offering rhymed warnings not to look directly into phosphorescent waters, believed by some to be inhabited. These stories were not always believed literally, but were respected, repeated. The caution encoded in the cadence often kept sailors alive. Modern-day marine biologists and anthropologists now try to match such verses with physical features. A reef described as the buried teeth of a sea lion in a chant from the Mombasa coast has been loosely correlated with a submerged shelf known to snag nets to this day. But interpretation is difficult. Symbols shift over centuries, and without regular recitation, even the clearest chart can blur. We return briefly now to the Hadramaut coast in Yemen, where entire villages once set out each spring for Zanzibar, loaded with incense, pearls, and frankincense. The journey could take weeks, and often relied on what sailors called the ghost path, a sequence of swell patterns and wind shapes passed down verbally, said to lead home even if no sun or star showed. There was a word in Arabic, sir, meaning secret, but also path. It was whispered when sailors spoke of certain waters, routes not marked on any map but passed between trusted voices. And unlike charts which could fall into the wrong hands, these paths remained safe as long as the tongue remembered. In the Maldives, too, an archipelago seemingly built for oral navigation, sailors used star lines and reef poems to weave through the labyrinthine channels between atolls. Certain chants described the taste of the water, how it would become sweeter or more mineral-rich as one approached inhabited islands. The sea tells you, they would say, if you're patient enough to let it speak. It's worth pausing here to reflect, not just on the ingenuity of those who sailed this way, but on the patience it demanded. To learn these verses was not a matter of a week or two. It took years, a lifetime sometimes. Apprentices had to listen closely, repeat under their breath, and eventually sail the verses with someone more experienced. And when they finally chanted them alone, it wasn't to recite, it was to survive. What modern navigation gained in precision, it may have lost in intimacy. A GPS will tell you where you are. A chant reminds you how far you've come and who taught you the way. When you sing the route, you're never truly alone. Even in the Persian Gulf, where oil rigs now glow like skeletal cities over the water, echoes of old chants survive. In the town of Corfacan, a museum once hosted an audio exhibit of maritime Safanat songs, collected in the 1950s by a Kuwaiti ethnographer. Most are fragmentary, a few lines only, but the voices are strong. One woman, whose husband had been lost at sea, recorded her version of a departure verse. It's less about geography than grief. She says, I watched his sail vanish like a prayer I forgot how to finish. These stories and verses were not static. They changed with the sea, were reshaped by currents and new mouths. And in this mutability lies their genius. Fixed maps can become outdated, but a chant, flexible and alive, evolves with every telling. It's not written in ink, but in memory. And memory, like water, finds a way to keep flowing. In 2021, an Omani sailor named Youssef in his 60s was asked if he ever sailed by verse. He said no, not exactly, but then recited perfectly and without hesitation the names of every headland between Sur and Socotra. When asked how he remembered, he laughed and said, because when I forget, I dream of them, like family I haven't seen in years. That, perhaps, is the real map, the one drawn not with coordinates but with connection. To places, to people, to the sea itself. And through voice, those connections endure. The ocean becomes not just a body of water, but a vast library, with every wave a turning page. Tonight, as your eyes begin to soften and your breath settles, imagine this. You are on the deck of a lateen-rigged dhow, the sails like stretched parchment overhead. The stars will slowly above, and from below comes the sighing of the sea. There is no compass, no chart, only the sound of a voice beside you, chanting softly. You don't understand the words at first, but their rhythm calms you. You begin to hear meaning in the pause between lines, in the hush of wind through ropes. A path is being shown in feeling, in sound, and as the chant continues, you realize you are no longer adrift. You are following, you are remembering, you are returning. So rest now, voyager. Let the waters hush and cradle you. Somewhere out there, an old verse is still being sung, not for the world to hear, but for the sea to remember. Good night. Welcome, voyager, on our final tale of the night. We drift toward a rocky coast where light once flickered not from electricity, nor from flame, but from the quiet patience of mirrors, glass, and a little luck with the moon. This is the story of a lighthouse that shone without fire, guiding mariners with nothing but reflection and resolve. A lighthouse lit, quite literally, by mirrors and moonlight. You know, some people say the moon can't hold a candle to the sun, but as tonight's story proves, it can certainly hold a lantern if you angle the mirrors just right. Before we wade further into this quiet marvel, I'd be glad if you'd leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you're somewhere coastal tonight, let us know where in the comments. Drop a coordinate, maybe a windswept cape or a blinking buoy you've passed by. Who knows, we might trace a tale back to your stretch of sea in a future episode. Now rest easy, let the hush settle in. Feel the weight of your limbs give in to stillness. Imagine a darkened cove, where the tide breathes slowly and gulls have gone to sleep. A low beam of light arcs over water. It flickers once and then holds. The hearth of the horizon stays warm. You're safe here. Our story tonight begins on a clifftop in the year 1823, on the southern coast of England, at a place called Lighthouse, a promontory near Beachy Head, chalky and sheer, where the cliffs plunge down into the English Channel like ancient walls washed clean. Maritime trade was thick here even then. Vessels from the East Indies, fishing smacks, packet ships heading for France or returning from America, all passed within sight of these white cliffs. And often they wrecked. The currents were strong, and fog rolled in like spilled ink over the sea. So many ships dashed themselves against the rocks that locals nicknamed the coastline the graveyard. But Lighthouse itself had long been bare. No flame crowned it, no rotating beacon cut through the fog. Mariners petitioned for a lighthouse. For decades they had. Some even wrote it into the ship logs before they sank. It was not until the winter of 1823 that a makeshift lantern tower was raised. But it lacked fuel. Oil deliveries to the top of the cliff were treacherous, and even when they arrived, wind gusts made keeping the flame lit nearly impossible. The lantern often sputtered out just as the weather worsened. So a local sea captain and amateur engineer, Jonathan Darby, proposed a strange solution. What if, during clear nights, they could light the lighthouse without oil or flame, by using a system of large mirrors, angled to capture the glow of the full moon? The idea was met with laughter by some. The moon, after all, was not consistent. It waned, it vanished, it hid behind cloud banks and followed a schedule of its own. But Darby insisted that even a flicker of light on a clear night might make the difference for an incoming ship, and in summer months, the moon would hang long and high over the water. Darby constructed a series of concave glass mirrors, polished and mounted within the lantern room. By day, they reflected sunlight into a beam, and by night, they could catch and concentrate the moon's light, bouncing it between surfaces to extend its reach out over the waves. Historical records suggest that this system was tested for several months, and during nights of full moon, ships at sea did report seeing a pale beam arcing out from the cliff. It wasn't strong, not like flame, but it was steady. On more than one occasion, captains testified that the shimmer from Lighthouse was what allowed them to steer clear of the rocks. Darby's mirrored system was modeled on an earlier technology known as the catoptric system, which had already been in use in early lighthouse construction across Europe. In the catoptric system, parabolic mirrors were used to concentrate light from oil lamps into beams, creating a stronger, more directed signal. But Darby's twist was in using ambient celestial light itself as the source. And what's even more fascinating is how his idea paralleled ancient practices. Long before lenses and lamps, coastal watchtowers in the Roman Empire and even in parts of Islamic Spain used polished metal or mirrored glass to signal between towers or reflect daylight seaward. The Pharos of Alexandria, often considered the archetype of all lighthouses, is rumored to have used polished bronze mirrors to project sunlight far into the Mediterranean, guiding vessels toward the Egyptian port. Darby, whether by instinct or research, had revived something old. In 1825, his system became the basis for a semi-permanent installation. Beltout began operating with a dual light method, an oil lamp for stormy nights and a mirror arrangement for moonlit ones. For nearly a decade, the mirror light method remained in place, until more powerful Fresnel lenses and a better oil supply chain rendered it obsolete. But the memory of the moonlit lighthouse lingered. Old letters from sailors, now archived in maritime museums in Portsmouth and London, speak in romantic terms of the pale glow at Beltout. One called it a shimmer from heaven's own lamp, while another wrote, "It was as if the cliff had caught a piece of the moon and held it up, for any ship in darkness to see and survive." Lighthouses remain powerful symbols, not just of navigation, but of patience and endurance, and how even the smallest light, if well placed, can change the course of a voyage. And so Beltout, the lighthouse lit by mirrors and moonlight, passed into legend. It no longer uses such a system today. In fact, the original structure was decommissioned in the early 1900s and moved back from the edge of the cliff to prevent collapse due to erosion. It now stands inland, no longer guiding ships but still catching the light. Perhaps that's the lasting metaphor of it all, that even when no longer needed, the idea of such a thing remains beautiful enough to preserve. Our story now widens, casting its beam to other shores, where mirrors and glass took on the burden of guidance long before electricity hummed in copper wires. Off the coast of Sweden, in the Kattegat Sea, the Cullen Lighthouse once used polished metal reflectors to cast its glow. Records from the 18th century show that glass and brass parabolas helped magnify the light of open flames, forming the early prototype of what would become more precise optical systems. Mariners from Denmark, sailing by Kulleberg, described the light there not as brilliant, but reliable. A silver flicker that danced just above the waves, as though Neptune himself were holding a candle. And in France, not far from where Augustin Fresnel would later perfect his lens system, smaller lighthouses experimented with mirrors wrapped in silvered copper, set at mathematical angles. The sea didn't care much for equations, but these arrangements often succeeded in piercing the salt-heavy fog, especially when aligned with starlight or a rising moon. In many ways, these early structures weren't built simply to resist nature. They were collaborations with it. Moonlight was free, so was sun. In a time when whale oil was costly, and the sea could turn impassable at a moment's notice, finding ways to bend and harness ambient light wasn't just clever, it was survival. By the mid-1800s, such experiments began to fade, not because they failed, but because something brighter had come along. Fresnel's lens, a brilliant invention made of concentric rings of glass, could trap even a weak flame and hurl it across miles of ocean. These new lights burned with the intensity of controlled fire, and no longer needed the cooperation of the sky. Still, in quiet corners of maritime lore, the idea of a moonlit lighthouse holds a certain poetry. There's something soft, almost reverent, about a light drawn not from combustion or command, but from reflection. And reflection, too, shaped the lives of those who lived in and maintained such lighthouses. At Beltout, lighthouse keepers were often poets in waiting. One such man, Henry Parsons, served from 1836 to 1841. In his diary, which now rests in a weathered folio at the Eastbourne Heritage Center, he describes the long nights on watch, the mirrors misting with sea spray, and the delicate ritual of wiping them clean with linen, then checking the moon's rise against a battered almanac. He wrote, "Tonight, the moon came late, hesitant behind cloud, but when it broke free, the mirrors caught her all at once, as if in chorus. I stood and watched it stretch itself into sea, Parsons had no illusions about the limits of mirror light. Fog was its enemy. Storms swallowed its shimmer whole. But on clear nights, he believed, something gentle and good passed between the moon and the mirrors, and then out into the dark, toward any sailor searching for a shape on the horizon. In that, perhaps, the story of Beltout becomes less about the technicalities of optics and more about belief, the human willingness to gather and shape what little light we have and offer it up as protection. Other lighthouses followed similar philosophies. In Japan's Seto Inland Sea, stone lantern towers known as Ishidoro once marked fishing routes, their light not from fire at all, but from whitewashed interiors and mirrored bronze surfaces, made to catch the earliest rays of dawn or the flicker of the stars. Coastal villagers memorized how the morning light played across these towers and passed down their glimmering language through generations. Even in the Arctic, stories are told of Inuit families who placed polished ice slabs near the entrances of snow huts, directing moonlight inward during the long polar nights. While not lighthouses in a strict sense, they were navigational aids nonetheless, beacons of orientation and calm. It seems that wherever humans found darkness pressing in, we found ways to offer light, even when fuel was scarce, even when all we had was reflection and timing. Returning to Beltout, the tale does not end in the 19th century. In 1999, after years of erosion threatened to tip the entire structure into the sea, engineers embarked on a remarkable effort to move the entire lighthouse inland, intact. It was shifted back from the cliff edge by 17 meters, placed carefully on rails, and settled on a new foundation. Now restored, it operates as a private residence and occasional guest house. But at night, it still catches the moon. The old lantern room, with its wide windows and arc of sky, reflects the stars across the English Channel, though no longer in service to sailors. Some say the moonlight there is stronger than it ought to be, that on certain clear evenings, the windows flash once, as if remembering their old duty. Others dismiss it as a trick of light, a coincidence. But even coincidences can comfort. And in a way, the story of a lighthouse lit by mirrors and moonlight is less about what was visible and more about what it meant. To know that someone had taken the time to polish glass, align it by hand, and wait for the moon, that someone had trusted that even a faint shimmer might be enough to make a difference, is to glimpse a quieter kind of heroism. So many coastal lives, past and present, are shaped not by grand architecture or blazing technology, but by small acts of care carried out in the dark. A mirror turned the right way, a window wiped clear, a man watching the tide. And even now, with automation and satellite beacons, lighthouses remain, more often than not, unstaffed and overlooked. But if you ever pass one at night, perhaps Beltout or Hookhead in Ireland, or the lonely towers of Brittany, and you see a glint just for a moment from glass high above, it may not be flame. It might just be the moon passing through old memory, just enough to light your way. Our story begins to drift now, like mist pulling back from the shore, but before it fades, let us circle back to where the sea and sky conspire quietly, where glass and silver once bent the dark just enough to guide a vessel home. There is a lighthouse off the coast of Portugal, Cabo de Roca, once thought to be the westernmost point of the known world. Long before the powerful beams of today swept the Atlantic, it was said that mariners navigating near those cliffs would steer not by the clarity of light, but by its rhythm. The moonlight danced on its upper windows with a kind of pulse, flickering in a pattern only the most practiced eyes could follow. For a brief time in the early 1800s, its lantern was unlit, and instead, a mirrored drum spun slowly, catching any moonlight and flinging it out to sea like a thread of spun silver. Sailors from Galicia and beyond came to trust that glimmer, waiting for it like a heartbeat in the fog. Such stories appear across coastlines where the elements leave little room for luxury. In the Faroe Islands, Some of the earliest navigational towers weren't lighthouses at all, but cairns, stacks of white painted stones. At specific times of year, just before midsummer, these cairns would reflect twilight with surprising brightness. Some locals took to polishing seashells or glass fragments and embedding them into the stones, hoping the refracted glint would stretch far enough to catch the eye of a returning fisherman. Though simple, such measures often spelled the difference between safe harbor and tragedy. In every one of these places, the light is not about brilliance. It is about notice. It is about a signal, however faint, that says, someone is waiting for you, someone hopes you return. Back in England, at Beltout, there's one final entry in Henry Parsons' diary that is worth sharing. It was dated October 30th, 1841, the night before his retirement from the keeper's post. He wrote, "Tonight, no ships passed. The moon arrived late, pale and tired, and the clouds came with her. I stood in the lantern room and looked out across the channel. Nothing but sea and my reflection. Still, I lit the glass, turned the mirrors, and made the room ready, in case someone looked back. There is something in that image, a man turning mirrors toward the sea, lighting nothing, but preparing everything, that lingers long after the page turns. Even now, modern lighthouse lenses are descendants of this philosophy. The Fresnel lens, though more powerful, still works through layers of reflection and redirection. Its genius lies not in brute force, but in focus, in using every fragment of available light to its greatest potential. Today, most lighthouses are powered by LEDs, connected to solar panels, and managed by maritime agencies from distant cities. The romance of moonlight and mirrors might seem quaint beside the data precision of GPS. But if you stand near a lighthouse, any lighthouse, at just the right moment, you might still see it. That quiet shimmer in the glass, a brief catch of light off a lens, a glint that feels older than the tower itself. And if it happens on a moonlit night, well, maybe you'll understand why someone once waited on a windy cliff, polishing brass and turning mirrors toward the horizon. Maybe you'll hear in it the echo of countless quiet acts. Sailors charting their way by a glimmer, keepers preparing a signal that might never be seen, villagers embedding shells in stone. Small things, but enough. The world changes always. Light becomes louder, towers grow taller, but there's still value in the old ways, in knowing that even moonlight can be shaped, that even the faintest reflection can be made useful, even beautiful. So if you find yourself beside the sea, especially on a night when the wind has softened and the moon is pulling the tide, take a moment to look for the old kind of light, the kind not made by flame or filament, but by angle, by timing, by care. And if you see it, know this: someone somewhere shaped that light for you, whether by mirror, by hope, or by memory, just enough to help you find your way home. Thank you for drifting with me tonight, Voyager. If the ocean ever looks too vast, remember, even the gentlest light has been enough for centuries. Let it be enough for you. Good night.